Like their predecessors in all wars, American veterans of the Vietnamese campaign who are coming home to civilian life have their heads filled with memories that may last the rest of their days. For no matter how far from the front a man may have spent his time as a soldier, he will remember it as a special time, when, fleetingly, his daily existence appeared to approach the heroic. Former Private First Class Sven Eriksson, as I shall call him, since to use his actual name might add to the danger he may be in, has also come back with his memories, but he has no idea what the future will do to them. These are the opening sentences of Casualties of War, a true story reported by journalist Daniel Lang and published in The New Yorker 50 years ago in 1969. 20 years later, in 1989, director Brian De Palma adapted the story into a Hollywood feature film. Casualties of War is one of my favorite films, both because it's quite possibly the most emotionally devastating of all the films which have ever been made about the war in Vietnam, and because it encapsulates everything which I adore about the filmmaking of Brian De Palma. Yet when the film first opened, it died at the box office. Since then, its popularity has slowly elevated throughout the ensuing decades, and filmmaker Laurent Bozereau put together some excellent making-of documentaries for the DVD release. But I've always wanted to know more. How did the original story first get written? How come most people have never even heard of, much less seen, the two other cinematic adaptations of this story which were made long before De Palma made his? How did De Palma finally get permission to make his film? What were the production experiences of some of the other cast and crew members who weren't interviewed on the DVD? These questions and others have long circulated in my mind, so to celebrate this year's 50th anniversary of the original Daniel Lang article, as well as the 30th anniversary of De Palma's film, I decided to put together this oral history video essay to consolidate as much information as I could find about the legacy of Casualties of War. Casualties of War is based on the true events of the incident on Hill 192, in which a young Vietnamese woman named Phan Thi Mao was gang-raped and murdered by an American squad during the Vietnam War in November 1966. One private first-class soldier refused to take part in the rape and the murder, and according to Frederick L. Borch III, the soldier reported the crime, despite threats against his life if he did so. According to Tom Fitzpatrick, journalist Daniel Lang heard about the story after reading all 7 volumes of the trial transcripts in the offices of the clerk of the courts at United States Army Judiciary in Falls Church, Virginia. As one of Lang's friends puts it, Lang wondered why this soldier stood up when no one else did. He wondered why some people are willing to take a stand, even when the cost is beyond what can be paid. Lang contacted the soldier's family and stated that he was pursuing a story about the incident. The family knew some people in St. Paul, Minnesota, who were able to do a background check on Lang and confirm that he was a legitimate journalist. After that, the soldier agreed to talk to Lang. To protect the soldier's privacy, Lang changed his name to the pseudonym Eriksson. Lang and the soldier met several times, and the result was Casualties of War, published in The New Yorker in October 1969. The first film adaptation to be made from the story was 1970's OK, produced by Dutch producer Rob Hauer and directed by German filmmaker Michael Verhoeven. In the summer of 1970, OK was accepted into the Berlin International Film Festival. Also accepted into that same festival was Dionysus in '69, directed by a young Brian De Palma. However, the event spiraled into disaster when the head of the festival, George Stevens, felt that OK was so anti-American that he disbanded the jury and then everyone went home.
Ironically enough, When I was at Berlin in 1970, the festival was closed because of an anti-American movie made by a German, which was Casualties of War. He had made the true story, and there was such a controversy over this film because it was so anti-American. This was in the midst of the Vietnam War. The jury couldn't disband, and the festival was over.
Because of this, OK never got a proper release, and Brian De Palma was unable to actually see OK for many years, although he comments that a friend eventually sent it to him. As for myself, I still haven't seen OK, despite my best efforts to track it down. I even contacted the filmmakers, hoping they could tell me where I might see it, but all my efforts led to a dead end. So if anyone knows where it can be seen, please let me know. Meanwhile, in the United States, according to Leonard Sloan, attempts were made by David Susskind, Jack Clayton, and Pete Hamill to adapt Casualties of War into a movie of their own, but nothing ever came of it. Beating them to the punch, Academy Award-winning legend Elia Kazan released an independent adaptation, The Visitors, in 1972.
Why did you tell me before? It was a brave thing to do.
No, it was too late. I should have stopped them. What's the point of punishing them afterwards?
People who are criminals have to be punished.
Look, the Viet Cong do exactly the same thing. Everybody does. Every day. Everywhere. Why blame these guys? They were my friends. They were my buddies.
In Jeff Young's book, Kazan, the master director discusses his films, Elia Kazan recalled, "It all began in a casual conversation with my son, Chris. I had just read Daniel Lang's essay, Casualties of War, a piece published in The New Yorker. I thought, my God, it would be interesting to speculate about what those two boys that had been turned in by their fellow soldier for raping and killing a young Vietnamese girl would do if, when they got out of jail, they came to visit the person who turned them in." Initially titled Home Free, The Visitors was filmed in 7 weeks on the Kazan property in Sandy Hook at a cost of $175,000, funded after Kazan took out a bank loan which was later reimbursed by United Artists. Kazan described the experience to his old collaborator Bud Schulberg thusly, "I'm out in the snow and the extreme cold a lot. It's great, like beginning all over again, and I'm enjoying the shit out of it." However, according to his biographer Richard Schickel, when Kazan previewed the film at the Schubert Theater, the audience became volubly restive. "Why are they laughing?" he kept asking Nick Kroffers, who had no gentle answer. In his autobiography, Kazan recalled, "We opened at the Little Carnegie Theater in New York. Chris and I had no idea what the audience reaction would be. We were both shocked when the film was booed at the end by part of the audience. As the audience moved out, I stood in the back of the theater, waiting for someone to come up and explain why the film had been received so hatefully. No one did." Kazan was fiercely protective of the picture and happy with it. Richard Schickel disagreed and called The Visitors glum, grainy, emotionally distant, and frankly, dull. Schickel also declared that the film was significantly miscast and that James Woods and Stephen Railsback should have switched roles. He added, "Finally, this is a painful movie to watch, lacking the energy and conviction Kazan had brought to his other films." Brian De Palma comments that when he saw The Visitors, he possibly saw it at Cinema One, but the concept of a fantasy about what might happen if Erickson was terrorized by his buddies coming back to get him was not something which interested De Palma. One of Brian De Palma's acquaintances was Tony Award-winning playwright David Rabe, who had served in Vietnam with a medical headquarters unit in 1966.
I grew up in the Midwest, and I had a kind of rough upbringing and a rough life in a certain way, but on the other hand, it was provincial, and I think I was fairly naive. And I think I had a kind of real trust in the basic goodness or the basic well-intention of people, and Vietnam pretty much eliminated that, or taught me that I'd best double-check most things. And it wasn't just the experience there, which, I mean, I was in a hospital unit and I was around a lot of things. I was not in the field. I mean, I was not in the boonies. It's not like I've become a cynic, because I haven't, or I wouldn't write the books and go ahead. But I think you have to be warier than I ever was. And I was exposed to everything is possible. I mean, human beings, it's obvious, are capable of everything. And then denying it. That's the major, they deny it. That's sort of the key mechanism, is the simultaneous denial.
And that's how they either maintain or what, sanity by denying it?
I think it's darker than that.
It's darker,
I think
much
it's darker.
darker.
The motivation is darker than that.
What do you think it might be?
I don't know. I believe in evil. I think there is evil. And Vietnam had a touch of that, for sure.
Two of Rabe's plays about Vietnam, The Basic Training of Pavel Hummel and Sticks and Bones, both opened in 1971. The Basic Training of Pavel Hummel premiered off-Broadway with William Atherton and Albert Hall. Eventually, it made its way to Broadway in a production which starred Al Pacino and won him the Tony Award for Best Actor.
Of course, David Rabe, who wrote this great play, and Pavlo, this great character.
Sticks and Bones won the Tony Award for Best Play, and David Rabe adapted it into a 1973 television movie directed by Robert Downey Sr., but instead of immediately airing it nationwide, CBS chickened out and canceled the air date. When producer Joe Papp went public with his complaints against the network, CBS reneged and aired Sticks and Bones with a disclaimer and no advertising. Many affiliates didn't show it at all, while others aired it at odd times, like at 5 a.m. or 3 p.m. Whenever the moment came where a commercial might have played, about every 20 minutes or so, the screen would go bling for about 30 seconds and then the film started up again. So basically it was buried, and you can't even find it on home video these days. Again, this is another film which I've been unable to find, so if anyone knows where it can be seen, I'd really appreciate it. One of Rabe's Vietnam plays which did get turned into a film that actually got released was 1976's Streamers, later adapted into a very good film directed by Robert Altman in 1983.
Shut up! Don't you go talking that weird shit too, all right? Don't you go talking that weird shit too, you hear me? No. Oh, man. I'm Carlisle. I'm Carlisle, man. You know me, man. You know me. You know me, man! Shit.
David Rabe comments that he may have first met Brian De Palma in the mid-1970s, around the time when Rabe's wife, Academy Award-nominated actress Jill Clayburgh, was starring in the TV movie Griffin and Phoenix. Clayburgh had known De Palma from Sarah Lawrence College, where she had appeared in De Palma's student feature film The Wedding Party a decade prior. By the early 1980s, De Palma and David Rabe had officially started working together. Rabe had written a draft of the screenplay for Prince of the City, which De Palma was set to direct. De Palma ended up getting replaced by Sidney Lumet on that film, and Rabe's draft of the script ended up getting replaced with a draft written by Lumet and J. Preston Allen, but De Palma remained in touch with David Rabe, who brought up the idea of adapting Casualties of War into a film. Rabe had actually met Daniel Lang, and believes he might have first reached out to Lang after he first read the Casualties of War story. Rabe remembers Lang as a low-key, lovely guy. Lang would die of leukemia in 1981. Brian De Palma had been familiar with the Casualties of War story ever since it was first published in The New Yorker, and he was certainly interested in turning it into a film, but at the time, no Hollywood studio would touch it with a 10-foot pole, or even one longer. That all changed in the late 80s when De Palma had a big commercial success at Paramount with The Untouchables, paving the way for him to get to make a riskier Hollywood film of his choosing. De Palma wanted to make Casualties of War next, and he was able to obtain permission from Daniel Lang's wife, Margaret. David Rabe remembers having discussions with Margaret about trying to determine what her late husband might have wanted. Rabe comments that Margaret was a wonderful, intriguing person. Casualties of War would not be the first time that Brian De Palma had tackled the subject of Vietnam. In his early underground independent films from the late 60s and early 70s, most notably Greetings and Hi Mom, he had addressed Vietnam through a satirical political lens.
Well, what are you doing here, Private Rubin?
What am I doing here? I don't know.
I mean in this particular area.
Oh, well, in this particular, search and destroy, sir.
You seek out the enemy and destroy them, is that right?
Yes, sir. Yes.
You ever been in the Army? You ever been over in Korea, Vietnam, or in the Second World? You haven't seen what I've seen. I've seen arms shot off. I've seen faces blown up. I've seen taken off.
Hey.
I'm sick of all that. I'm sick of all that.
However, the war in Vietnam was still raging in those days, and movies about Vietnam rarely did good business. De Palma had had far bigger commercial and cult success directing Hollywood genre pictures, suspense thrillers like Carrie and Dressed to Kill, action-packed gangster epics like Scarface and The Untouchables. He definitely knew how to put on a show and entertain a mass audience, but Casualties of War would be different. As Julie Salomon puts it, this story didn't allow for the satiric distance De Palma usually put between himself and his emotions on film, and it certainly didn't allow for the pop playfulness that made The Untouchables so safe and so popular. He saw Casualties as a chance to confront directly his recurring theme, the serious moral consequences of a failure to act, or of acting too late. There would be no hiding behind the conventions of suspense or action genre films this time. He would be openly admitting that he longed to make a big, important film that was visually splendid, but also had serious thematic concerns.
Oh, God. I'm sorry.
He knew there was no chance that a dark picture like Casualties could match The Untouchables at the box office, but he told himself over and over not to get caught up in the Hollywood value system, that he should be grateful to be making a film that meant something. But he knew the success of The Untouchables had enabled him to make Casualties. He'd been on the other side too many times. He knew all too well how fast the doors closed after a failure. When he considered the possibility that Casualties would not be a commercial hit, he felt physically ill. De Palma's Casualties of War project received support from Don Steele, who was then the head of production at Paramount. David Rabe was commissioned to write the screenplay, and after discussing it with De Palma, he laid out the dramatic plot and the interaction with the major characters. Unfortunately, a higher-ranking Paramount executive had no interest whatsoever in the project.
We developed the script with David Rabe at Paramount. This brilliant script that he wrote. And when we had the meeting with the head executive, Ned Tannen, and he just looked at us and say, "Who wants to see this? This is depressing. This is awful." And they put it in turnaround.
Things got even worse while Dawn Steele was in the hospital going into labor giving birth to her daughter, when suddenly she found out that Ned Tannen and another Paramount executive, Frank Mancuso, had decided to fire her without even letting her know.
I have to tell you that it was a difficult day, if you will, and after 17 or 18 hours of labor and an emergency C-section, you know, I was relieved. I had this healthy child in my arms. I was healthy. My husband went out for a minute and came back, and his face was white, and he was carrying the trade papers, Variety.
Right.
And on the front page of Variety, it basically said that I had lost my job while I was in labor. And what had happened was I had not been getting along with the man who had become my boss after Barry and Michael Eisner and Jeffrey left. Ned Tannen and Frank Mancuso.
You had dated.
I had dated. Date.
Yes.
Just date.
Right.
Fortunately, Steele endured this public humiliation. She got a job as president of Columbia, bought the rights to Casualties of War, and took it with her. The film never would have been made without her, and the fact that she was once head of Michael J. Fox's company got Fox interested in playing the part of Erickson. At one point, Steele was even going out with Fox, so De Palma got to know her quite well on a social basis.
At that point in time, Dawn Steele moved to Columbia, and when she was there, she said, "Look, you guys still want to do this? Bring it over here. Let me get it and turn around from Paramount." So Dawn deserves a lot of credit. And not only was Dawn responsible in bringing it to Columbia, but she was extremely supportive in terms of letting Brian make the movie he wanted to make.
What De Palma and David Rabe disagreed on was how to actually begin the film from a story standpoint. After starting the film with Erikson falling asleep on the bus, Rabe wanted to begin Erikson's dream with the Vietnam sequence in the village during daylight, with Erikson offering candy to village children and even being ready to eat a piece of food the villagers offered him. His education and the cynicism needed to survive would begin there with mockery and warnings from Meserve and Clark. The company would then walk into the nighttime enemy ambush in the jungle, bringing the realization that they had been betrayed, set up by the villagers. Following the nighttime jungle battle sequence, Erikson would still be willing to help with the plowing of the rice paddy, a farm boy at heart. The death of Brownie would have happened after the nighttime battle in the jungle, as it does in the film. However, De Palma did not like the idea of cutting from Erikson sleeping on the train during the daylight and then to another daylight scene. It made more sense to him to cut from daylight on the train to nighttime in the jungle. The issue here for Rabe was the narrative implications. At the time, he argued that to see Erikson completely naive after the nighttime battle undermined the sense of suspicion that would have begun in him about whether or not the Vietnamese could be trusted. This could have fed into the confusion he felt as the kidnapping started. Another change which De Palma made to the script was to have Erikson apologize to the Vietnamese during the kidnapping. David Rabe argued that this gave Erikson moral clarity about what was going on at too soon of a point in the story. Rabe wanted Erikson to have to struggle to understand what was going on, since he was new to Vietnam, dependent on the men in the patrol, especially on Sean Penn's character, Meserve, and suspicious of the Vietnamese. Therefore, Rabe didn't think Erikson would linger behind to immediately apologize to the villagers. Rabe argued that to have Erikson struggle to know what to do would be more dramatic, the outcome being somewhat in doubt. On the other hand, Rabe felt that after a recent viewing of the film, his first in some 30 years, the concern he had in 1989 had evaporated. More on that later. The production of Casualties of War has been documented in 2 making-of documentaries by Laurent Bozereau on the film's DVD, but there are many other stories about the making of the film which haven't yet been publicly told. I managed to track down several unsung members of the cast and crew, and they were kind to share their memories with me. Co-producer Fred Caruso had begun his filmmaking career working as a production assistant and as a songwriter for Otto Preminger, who'd been impressed by a cover letter written by Caruso which began with the words, "Exposure is the key to success. Let me tell you about myself." Caruso's big break came in the 1970s when he was hired as production manager for The Godfather. In the 1980s, he had a huge independent success producing David Lynch's Blue Velvet, and he'd worked with Brian De Palma on 2 previous pictures, Dressed to Kill and Blowout. One of Caruso's duties as co-producer on Casualties of War would be to assemble the film's crew. With the notable exception of cinematographer Stephen H. Barrum, it was a mostly English crew. Caruso remembers that one day on the set, De Palma congratulated him by saying, "Good crew." De Palma himself comments that Caruso always knew how to assemble a very good group of people. Having achieved a major success just a few years earlier putting the cast of Oliver Stone's Platoon through realistic basic training, Captain Dale Dye was running the company Warriors Incorporated when he was asked to put the cast of Casualties of War through basic training in Thailand. At the time, Dye was finishing work on the ABC television series Supercarrier and could not make the deadline to be in Thailand to start putting the cast of Casualties of War through basic training. Dye had actually served in the United States Marine Corps during the war in Vietnam. His experiences were briefly documented in the book Dispatches by Michael Herr, and one of his pals during the war was Sergeant Mike Stokey. Stokey was working at an animation firm when Dye asked him to serve as the main military advisor on Casualties of War. Originally, the plan was for Stokey to work with Sergeant Stan White, who had been the real-life inspiration for the movie Year of the Dragon, but then White was let go, leaving Stokey with the task of training the cast of Casualties of War largely by himself at first. Stokey formed bonds with Sean Penn and with Army Major Art Smith, who had been hired by Fred Caruso and came into the production in the middle of boot camp. Stokey loved being in Thailand and says that working with Brian De Palma was great. At one point, while Stokey was stopping to survey the terrain, De Palma asked him what he was doing, and Stokey remarked that he just loved the land and its smell of chlorophyll and the dampness of the plants. Stokey trained the actors by teaching them how to clean and assemble weapons, and by having them play war games in the jungle. Still, Thailand was not without its dangers. After the actors had captured a bunker complex, Stokey remembers one moment when Sean Penn put his hand on the branch of a tree when suddenly a snake slithered down and spooked the hell out of him. At another time, a snake fell out of a rafter in front of Penn. Captain Dye, meanwhile, decided to get himself involved in the production in another capacity, as an actor. Producer Art Linson wasn't keen on Dye playing the part of Captain Hill, but Dye snagged the role by walking in with De Palma and with casting director Lynn Stallmaster, and by doing impressive improvisations. Dye was familiar with the Casualties of War story, and because he had actually served in Vietnam, he knew where the warts were. This was a truthful, important story that people needed to hear, and it would add to the lexicon of the Vietnam experience. Actor Darren E. Burrows recalls that Captain Dye would say things like, "See the elephant and hear the owl."
Erickson, these men fucked up good. But you bringing formal charges against them? Is that going to help that poor girl one little bit?
Maybe if you had been there, sir. Maybe if you had heard her screaming, you'd feel...
You don't tell me shit about screaming, boy! I've heard a lot of fucking screaming in this country. Most of it's come from wounded American boys.
During the filming of the early sequence in the village, Michael J. Fox was a little leery of the water buffalo. Captain Dye warned Fox that water buffalo do not like the way that Americans smell.
Hey, man. Ain't you supposed to be hauling water to your thirsty fellow soldiers instead of hanging out with this dubious motherfucker, man?
Yeah.
So let's go then.
Right.
Erik King remembers that he initially wasn't cast in the role of Brownie, but ended up in the film once the cast was already undergoing military training in Thailand. He got a call saying, "They need you right now," and he was at once thrilled, exhilarated, and scared. He wanted to do his best to represent Brownie, who would be a symbol of the fallen GI soldier, a catalyst whose death would cause the main characters to lose their morale, their faith in the war, and their trust in the strange civilians living all around them. Once he underwent training for the role, King realized that he hated wearing wet clothes, but he was aware that it was nothing compared to what the real guys went through. Brian De Palma comments, "I basically had a jungle set in the jungle. Because of the jungle, especially at night, it's totally confusing, complete chaos. In order to show another part of the jungle, I had the Thai crew move vegetation and trees around, and suddenly you would be in another part of the jungle. It's a very confusing environment. There were snakes in the jungle all the time. We had to have snake wranglers go in and take the snakes off the set before we put the actors in it. You'd be walking into the set and a cobra would jump up and be staring right at you. You know, they jump straight up. It can be quite dramatic." The opening battle sequence was so visceral that, as Erik King puts it, your body reacts to it. In the moment where he handed Meserve the phone while he was on his back, it felt real. There was immediacy to it. No time to dick around. King had had experience with squibs on the film Street Smart, and comments how it really feels like, god damn, you feel the reaction of the squib. King comments that Sean Penn was amazing at showing up and getting straight into character whenever the camera was rolling. During Brownie's death scene between shots, while King was bleeding, Penn never let go of King's hand. He particularly loved the line, "I'm gonna hypnotize you."
Sarge! Look in my fucking eyes! I'm gonna hypnotize you! Good. You're fine!
I know it, man.
I know it. I know it.
In the scene where a dying Brownie is transported via helicopter, King really was laying on a real helicopter, flying up into the air. The stretcher was extended just a bit so that you could still see the clouds in the shot.
I'm a armor-plated motherfucker. I'm a armor-plated motherfucker. I'm a armor-plated motherfucker.
King thought to himself, is this going to be okay? I hope this goes well. The crew asked King if he was okay with it, and he said it was. He trusted Brian De Palma.
You really say that? Wouldn't do it, would you? Bring your girl? Are you crazy?
Cast in the role of Rowan, actor Jack Gwaltney says that he met Michael J. Fox during auditions for James Bridges' film adaptation of Bright Lights, Big City. Though he didn't get a part in that film, Gwaltney says that Fox may have put in a good word for him during casting for Casualties of War. To prepare for the production, Gwaltney read a lot of books, the Congressional Medal of Honor, Dispatches. He'd grown up in Virginia, so he already knew how to hunt and handle weapons. Gwaltney interpreted the character of Rowan as being simply a guy who had never heard of a situation like the one Erickson finds himself headed into. His was a character living in denial.
I mean, some broad in your pack. You see how nuts that sounds? That'll never happen, G.I.
Am I talking? I can't tell if I'm talking or not, man.
John C. Reilly's role, Hatcher, was initially cast with Stephen Baldwin in the part. However, as De Palma recalls, because Hatcher was such a thick-headed character, his take was coming off as more comic than I liked. After watching a lot of rushes, I was concerned it wasn't the right tone for the character. Fortunately, John C. Reilly was part of the second unit of soldiers we had trained, and I got him to replace Stephen. Nothing I like doing, something I don't think I've ever done before or after. But when you see rushes and see something you don't like, you have to do something about it. Thuy Thu was 23 years old when she was cast as the village girl Own. In an interview with Mary H.J. Farrell and Kathy Nolan, Thuy revealed that in 1975, her family had fled Saigon on a ship. She recalled, we'd hear about what battle was going on where, who won, who lost, but at that time, I didn't really care. I was little. The movie made me understand how the Vietnamese were living and the fear they were feeling. She'd been an American living in Paris and applying to colleges there when, in 1988, she saw De Palma's open casting call posted on the door of a Vietnamese restaurant in Paris's Chinatown. She answered it, admitting, I thought maybe it would be a summer job as an extra. If I had known it was for a major role, I wouldn't have gone. At the audition, dozens of young actresses were told to look scared and yell. Then, after seeing Thuy's performance on videotape, De Palma came to Paris to make his final selection. He commented, there was something about the electricity in Thuy's eyes, her passion, that was stunning. Several days after meeting with De Palma, Thuy was on her way to Bangkok for 4 months of filming. Thuy stated, I'd never been in front of a camera before, and being in that role was even worse. Some days I'd go back to my hotel upset. I'd think, oh God, what am I doing here? Thuy described the harrowing rape scene at the center of the film as really intense. David Rabe concurs and describes this scene as haunting in the way Brian and the actors depict the awkwardness, along with the harrowing violence, in a sequence that is utterly, sadly real. However, the hardest scene for Thuy was the one in which she pleads with Erickson to help her escape. Thuy was not given a copy of the script, which meant that much of what she spoke in Vietnamese had to be improvised.
I don't understand. I don't understand. I don't know what you're saying. I don't know what you're saying.
Although she enjoyed the attention she received from the film, Thuy decided not to pursue an acting career afterwards, explaining, to tell you the truth, I don't expect any offers after this. It was just this experience that I'm very grateful for.
Don't fuck with me. You're taking your turn in here.
No, I ain't raping nobody.
Well, you think you're saying no to me? You ain't hotshot enough to be saying no to me. Motherfucker! Motherfucker, you think you're standing up to me? Ah!
The tabloids made up reports that Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn were having a feud on the set, but Sergeant Mike Stokey insists that this was not the case. Prior to this film, Penn had starred in Shanghai Surprise and wasn't happy with his performance in that movie, so he'd come into Casualties of War with more of a laser focus on what he was doing.
Sean and I didn't speak a whole lot. We spoke a lot before we went, but during the making of the film, his intensity was such that it would have been such a convoluted approach to form any kind of a social thing that I don't think either one of us was really inspired to do it. So I just kind of let that lie. And also I really enjoyed working with Sean, so I didn't want to corrupt that either. I liked thinking that he was a complete son of a bitch. I wrote him a note on my last day of shooting and I said, you know, Sean, I can't really say it's been a pleasure, but it has been a privilege. And he was very proud of that. He called me up and said, I love the note, you know. I said, well, that's all true.
You probably like the Army, don't you, Eric? I hate the Army.
This ain't the Army. This ain't the Army, Sarge.
Yea, though I walk through the valley of evil, I shall fear no death. Cause I'm the meanest motherfucker in the valley.
Before he got cast as the unfortunate Cherry Soldier in Casualties of War, Darren E. Burrows had had one job prior which got him into the Union. For this role, he had to audition with hundreds of other actors for Lynn Stallmaster. A month later, he was asked to come read for Brian De Palma. The flight to Thailand marked Burrows' first time ever on a plane, and he remembers that Thailand was infested with mosquitoes that were as big as birds. Burrows got food poisoning during filming and remembers that he was vomiting in between takes. Now here's an intriguing coincidence. Burrows' father, actor Billy Drago, played Frank Nitti in The Untouchables, but this apparently had nothing to do with Burrows' casting in Casualties, and Burrows comments that he can't remember if De Palma was even aware of the connection. It's interesting, though, especially when you reflect that Drago and Burrows both played characters who died horrible deaths in the two films which De Palma directed back-to-back in the late 80s. The sequence where Burrows' character, the Cherry, gets killed initially was meant to take place over different days. It wasn't all going to happen in one scene. This complex sequence would take 3 days to shoot. At first, De Palma tried to achieve the whole scene in one long, single Steadicam shot. But the Steadicam was still semi-new technology at the time, and despite multiple takes, the scene could not be captured in one shot. The camera operator was too tense and had to be replaced, and it was Fred Caruso's job to fly in a new camera operator. When the new operator landed, he tried to bicker about his deal, but Caruso told him that if he didn't accept his current deal, he'd have to get back on the plane. The new operator accepted the deal and stayed.
What are you guys talking about? Don't worry about it.
I better go find my own squad. I don't feel right. I feel like I'm doing something wrong. I'll see you guys later.
Hey. I don't think you will see us later if you don't stop bopping around here like it's a goddamn playground. Just take it easy, okay? Slow down. All right. Talk, there he goes. He had rendezvoused with his brain recently.
In the section of the scene where the Cherry character was going to be killed, Sergeant Mike Stokey talked De Palma out of the idea of killing Cherry with a bomb, explaining that a bomb would be too powerful and would kill too many of the characters in the surrounding area, and that it would be more practical if Cherry were blasted away via a toe popper trap, and then if he were impaled onto spikes. Darren Burrows was flown back to the set so that the production could make a life-size casting of him and his head. Burrows flew back to Thailand with the fake head, then got in trouble with Thailand security. Burrows had to clearly explain to the custom agents what he was doing. They made some calls and he was released. Ultimately, however, De Palma didn't like the fake head because it looked too much like rigor mortis had set into it. Finally, Burrows himself had to be strapped down during the shot, and he remembers that all the smoke on the set made filming uncomfortable.
Pathetic dumbass Cherry.
Wait a minute. This goddamn thing is turning us on our heads, Ron. We're getting it backwards, man.
Because it's a day in, day out dose of bullshit, man, is what
I
it
mean,
is.
just because each of us might at any second be blown away, everybody's acting like we can do anything, man. And it don't matter what we do. But I'm thinking maybe it's the other way around, you know? Maybe the main thing is just the opposite. Because we might be dead in the next split second, maybe we gotta be extra careful what we do. Because maybe it matters more. Jesus, maybe it matters more than we even know.
During filming of the scene where Erickson gets into an argument with the Captain Hill character, Captain Dale Dye recalls that at the time, he knew nothing about acting. He credits Michael J. Fox for encouraging him to launch into it as if he was speaking to one of his soldiers. This kept Dye from being conscious of the camera and allowed him to really let loose.
You on my frequency?
Yes, sir.
You fucking maggot! Who the hell do you think you are? You're in that report recommending reserve for a Bronze Star. He pulled you out of a VC tunnel, boy. Now, the shit with that girl, that was wrong. But he's a kid, Erickson. He's 20 goddamn years old. And you're gonna ruin his life. He saved yours.
Despite the grim nature of the film's story, the production of Casualties of War wasn't all hard work and unpleasantness. The cast members stayed in the same hotel and performed karaoke together. Jack Gwaltney remembers that he and Captain Dye were judges in a talent show, and during the show, Dye would tell Gwaltney stories about the real war. Suddenly, the talent show got rowdy and a drunken fight broke out on stage. Dye calmly continued telling his story, and although Gwaltney got concerned by the fight happening on stage in the background, Dye assured him, "Son, you don't want to get involved in that," and smoothly walked away. Dye knew of a restaurant run by Thai women which was beside a dusty road in Thailand, and which allegedly served rum containing snake's venom. He and Michael J. Fox went there and they drank the rum, although Dye doubts that it really contained any venom in it. At another point, Michael J. Fox fearlessly jumped into a pen full of cobras, and Dawn Steele admitted in her memoirs that she was so freaked out, she went home quickly. The film is bookended with scenes of Erickson, now living in the present day, seeing a woman on a train who looks like Owen, then falling asleep and, theoretically, casting the passenger in the role of Owen as played out in his dream. However, Brian De Palma and David Rabe had differing ideas about how to write the ending, where Erickson finally wakes up and speaks to the passenger. David Rabe explains, "I always wanted the idea of Erickson on the bus to frame the story, with him falling asleep and then waking from the nightmare of Vietnam to see the girl who resembled the Vietnamese girl as the book ends. The difference was, I wanted a bus traveling in the farmlands, where the movie would have begun, and then the end would have the girl on the bus with him saying hello. I believe my first version had him helping her with groceries she spilled, but with the same emotional idea, the same need to make contact with her, finally saying hello in Vietnamese, only in a snowfall, with her walking away and dissolving in the falling snow while he watches." De Palma and Art Linson decided instead to have Rabe write a scene which more directly communicated the film's theme of Vietnam as being like a bad dream that has ended, like a disease that is healed over time. De Palma wanted the film to be more about the need for the public to move on from the war. There had also been a dream sequence in the script, in which Erikson and his wife and daughter are all attacked inside their home by an intruding Meserve and Clark. This surreal sequence was never filmed. Sergeant Mike Stokey comments that Sean Penn didn't think it was necessary. Rabe recalls that the revenge scene was conceived with De Palma and with Art Linson in an early meeting. The image of the flashlight in Erikson's face and that of his family, repeating the moment that would have occurred in the hut as the girl was kidnapped, felt strong, and so Rabe did his best to fulfill the idea, even though he worried there was already enough violence in the story already. When it was dropped from the actual film, he was relieved. On the DVD, De Palma says that he didn't film this dream sequence because...
I said, I can't go through life thinking about Erikson every day, waiting for those guys to, get out of the brig and come and get him. I feel that it's more in fitting with our feelings about Vietnam, which was, it was a terrible nightmare. What I wanted to sort of show, basically, was the Vietnamese recovered. What's our problem? Because, many Vietnamese came here, started new lives. They managed to go on with their lives, and I wanted to have that feeling at the end of this movie that this terrible nightmare had happened, but you cannot let this wound not heal. You've got to move on, and that's what I wanted to suggest by having Erikson see a Vietnamese that had moved on. Maybe he could move on.
Xiao Ko.
Do I remind you of someone?
Yeah.
I made Thuy play the part, but I put glasses on her and a different nose.
You had a bad dream, didn't you?
She couldn't have the same voice, so I had her voice dubbed by Amy Irving. So she's a different girl, but she's Vietnamese, and she reminds him of the girl from the village. Vietnam is a tragic melody that just suddenly stops, and there's no reason for it. You'll never be able to explain it. It's like you have some type of terrible pain, and then suddenly it stops. You don't know why, and you thank God it's not coming back.
It's over now, I think. Chào.
When De Palma and his editor, Bill Pankow, finally finished post-production work on Casualties of War, the first public test screening was held at a theater in Boston. De Palma unequivocally believed Casualties of War to be his best film, and he invited Steven Spielberg to the test screening, since he and Spielberg were close friends in those days. Spielberg attended this screening with a baseball cap pulled down over his brow, and was seated next to Art Linson and Don Steele. De Palma seated himself in the front row with his back to the screen so that he could observe the audience's reactions. Earlier in the day, De Palma was heard to say, "It's so intense, people may get up and leave," and sure enough, in the middle of the screening, half a dozen people did pick up and leave. According to journalist Bruce Weber, when the film finally ended and the lights went up, the theater was silent. As opinion cards were being distributed, Spielberg leant across Don Steele, whose fists were not yet unclenched, and he murmured to a man sitting on her opposite side, "You'll be thinking about this for a week." De Palma was disappointed with the reception at the test screening and wondered if maybe the film's concluding scenes could be simpler. Before the film was put into general release, it was made a little shorter, so the scenes of Erikson being confronted about how true his story is and about what else he could have done to save On were cut out. Don Steele tried to stay optimistic about the film's prospects, saying in an interview, "It's very simple. Historically, Vietnam movies have been profitable. All of them. Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now, The Deer Hunter, you're looking at movies that have been not pretty successful, but very successful. The foreign numbers have been extraordinary. However, Steele did not want the film to be marketed as being about a rape and murder, even though, well, that's exactly what it was. And after the screening in Boston and an additional test in Houston, she canceled another scheduled interview. Among the rave reviews which Casualties of War received was one by De Palma's most qualified critical champion, Pauline Kael, who hailed it as one of those rare, pure films which can affect us in more direct, emotional ways than your average movie. On opening night, in August of 1989, De Palma noticed that a show at an Upper East Side theater in Manhattan was sold out, briefly boosting his optimism for the film's chances. Unfortunately, all high hopes for the film's commercial prospects were instantly dashed the next morning when Dawn Steele gave De Palma the call from the West Coast. In the past, Steele typically began her phone conversations with De Palma by saying, "Hey, motherfucker, how you doing?" But De Palma knew he was in trouble the moment Steele began this particular phone call by simply saying, "Hello, Brian," and by reporting that the grosses weren't very promising. Having played on 1,486 screens around the country, the $22.5 million film had grossed a dismal $2 million on opening night, and went on to gross only a little over $18 million in domestic sales.
Nobody cares, Reserve. Oh, I told everybody. I told them, you don't have to worry. You don't have to try and kill me, man. I told them, and they don't care!
On the Thursday before Labor Day weekend, De Palma flew off to attend the film's opening at a festival in Deauville, France. Although the crowds there enthusiastically applauded the film, De Palma hadn't gotten over the lukewarm reception in the U.S. As he revealed to author Julie Salomon, the following Sunday morning, De Palma wandered out of his hotel to buy a newspaper and collapsed in the street. 2 journalists rushed over to help him, but he couldn't stand because his right ankle was badly sprained. However, De Palma clarifies today that he doesn't think this collapse had to do with the reception of Casualties. It had happened to him once in Washington Square, once when he was on Fifth Avenue, and once in Deauville. Since then, the concluding scenes of Erickson being interrogated have been restored by De Palma into contemporary home video releases of the film. David Rabe describes these restored scenes as being very strong and of value. Despite its underwhelming reception in 1989, Casualties of War is a film that lingers with those who watch it, and certainly those who made it. Fred Caruso comments that Casualties of War was the most difficult production I ever was on, and yet the most challenging and satisfying one. Brian was always supportive, the crew were always first class, and the Thai people were wonderful. Brian De Palma has always stood by Casualties of War. He has even admitted that the film and the musical score by Ennio Morricone is sometimes too emotionally overwhelming, even for him.
It's a very sad movie. I can't listen to that score.
C'est un film très triste. Chaque fois que je réentends la musique, ça me bouleverse.
And it's difficult for me to watch.
As for David Rabe, he has come to understand that the concerns he had about Casualties of War when it initially came out had much to do with the fact that he was a vet, and not unlike Captain Dale Dye, he had wanted both sides of the coin shown. David Rabe explains, "I had concern that the film truly present them all as casualties to some degree, not exonerate them, but create an environment that brought some logic to what they did." When he recently looked at the film, partially due to conversations he and I were having, and also encouraged by reading positive reviews written on Amazon by other veterans, Rabe's appreciation of the film significantly increased. His criticisms disappeared, when considered against the shot-by-shot brilliance and bravery of Brian's storytelling and the acting, especially that of Sean and Michael. He'd also come to have a far greater appreciation of the near heroism it took for Brian and Dawn Steele to dare to make this film. Overall, when considering Casualties of War as a whole achievement, David Rabe concludes, "It is a great film. I was rocked to my core seeing it this time, and am very proud of it. What I hoped would be conveyed is there. It comes through powerfully, and there are many striking sequences of gorgeous direction and filmmaking. Almost too many to count." Thanks for watching.